Kia ora and welcome to this webinar organized by the Religious Diversity Center. The title of this webinar is Hate Speech Restrictions, a threat to our democracy. My name is Beate Mattis and I will be your host tonight. Before I introduce our wonderful panelists, I would like to say a few words of introduction. The Religious Diversity Centre Aotearoa New Zealand, or short the RDC, is a New Zealand initiative aimed at getting people from all traditions, religious, spiritual, secular, to meet together and to work together. We value understanding and respect for all. In this context, we have organized this event tonight. The government has proposed a discussion paper on incitement of hatred and discrimination. And we would like to lead a respectful discussion on this document. We will start by having a panel discussion between our three guests and will then open up to questions from the audience. Once we've opened the floor for the questions, please type your questions into the Zoom Q&A field. I might summarize some of the questions if they are the same or similar questions, and I will address the panelists. Your comments will not be visible to the public, but the webinar will be recorded and then afterwards uploaded on YouTube. With these words, I would like to introduce our speakers, our guests. First of all, we have Paul Morris. Professor Paul Morris is Emeritus Professor of Religious Studies, Victoria University of Wellington, and the UNESCO Chair in Interreligious Understanding and Relations in New Zealand and the Pacific. During this session, I will call him Paul from Wellington because we have another Paul with us. Then we have Professor Douglas Pratt. He's formerly Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Waikato. Since retirement 3 years ago, he has been an honorary professor in the Theological and Religious Studies program at the University of Auckland. He continues being involved in a major international research project in the history of Christian-Muslim relations. He has published widely in the fields of religious extremism and Christian-Muslim relations. And then we'll have Paul from Auckland. He is a distinguished professor and honorary research associate of Te Kura Pukenga Tangata College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Massey University, New Zealand. And he is the chair of the International Metropolis Project. Now I'd like to hand over to Professor Paul Morris, Paul from Wellington, and he will introduce the topic tonight. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Beate. Kia ora, talofa, malo, salam alaikum, shalom, good evening. I plan to introduce the topic more generally and also to persuade you that my views on hate speech are correct. First, it's important to note that reflection on hate speech is happening across the world as legislation is designed, reviewed, and amended. So, in part in response and with direct reference to March 15th, the United Nations launched its Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech in May 2019. This calls on all UN governments, all governments that are members of the UN, along with civil society and individuals to address and counter increasing hate speech. Building on earlier United Nations work, hate speech is identified as a precursor to atrocity crimes and genocide. The UN have produced evidence supporting the contention that atrocities and violence are indeed preceded most often by escalating hate speech, and that hate speech restricts the inalienable rights and freedoms of individuals and communities. This international context is important for two reasons. Firstly, positively, we in Aotearoa New Zealand are part of an international debate and discussion that seeks to reinforce human rights globally. And secondly, and considerably more negatively, we are recycling positions, concerns, fears, and anxieties that often have little or nothing to do with our proposed law changes, but do raise temperatures and emotions and limit engagement and debate. This recycling has led to misinformation of Trumpian proportions, engendering real oppositions and divisions, but often based on misrepresentations and misunderstood positions. It's important to make a basic distinction between the United States, the US, and other contexts. Most of the misunderstandings are caused by using United States arguments, American arguments, in New Zealand, a non-US context, and yet a further example of Americanization. Very briefly, in the US, the rights and values of freedom are enshrined in a constitutional system that understands freedom of speech as embodied in the First Amendment to be the principal freedom. All other rights are understood to be dependent on this first foundational amendment, that is the basis of American democracy. The minimal US argument is that this basis gives the right to speak out against the restriction of any other right. So in the US, hate speech is legally protected in public discourse, except when it involves incitement of lawless action in circumstances in which it's likely to produce such action. Even violence by itself is insufficient for prescription. It's only when incitement takes place in a context in which such violence is imminent that American law recognizes the state can legitimately prohibit or punish those engaged in hate speech. On the other hand, outside of the US, it's the context of hate speech that is prioritized, the harm it causes and the intention behind it. And other values than freedom of speech are highlighted as central and integral. So the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948 begins with the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, and sees this as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace. Many constitutions likewise insist that dignity and equality are more important or as important as liberty. Where this is the case, hate speech is considered as an assault upon the dignity of those who are so targeted, and a threat to equality. And there is a much greater readiness to consider prohibitions on hate speech based on the content and context of hate speech. The difference between the US position and the majority of other countries can be seen most clearly, that's 168 other countries, including New Zealand, that are signatories of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights from 1966. Any advocacy, it reads, of national, racial or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility or violence shall be prohibited by law. It took the United States until 1992 to ratify the convention, but only then they did so with a caveat that while it agreed with Article 20, which I just read to you above, they added to it, except where it conflicts with the First Amendment. And their reading of the document was that Article 19, which is the freedom of expression, was the governing article for the limitations on it, which are these subordinate limitations, which were hate speech. So the focus on the US is on the instrumental role of such speech in generating violence or other unlawful acts. Outside of the US, the problem with hate speech is not only that it can lead to violence, but that it denies dignity and equality to individuals and groups to which they identify and belong, insisting that they're not equal, they're of less status, and are worthy thus of less protection. They're to be feared, mistrusted, and they cannot be equal participants in our collective life. Hate speech demeans and diminishes their dignity and their equality. In the US, the argument is that to live with this hate speech is simply, as one legal academic puts it, the price you pay for the greater and more foundational freedom of speech. And that more speech will somehow sort this out, or that such restrictions are but the deliberately thin edge of the wedge of greater state restrictions to our freedoms. We already recognize legitimate limits to the freedom of speech. We ban the harms of defamation, obscenity, sedition, violations of national security, violations of privacy, and the promotion of hatred or hostility. Hate speech, however, is often coded and indirect and designed to be covert and secret, and we do need to factor that in explicitly. Lastly, before turning to the New Zealand proposed law changes, I'd like to discuss one further argument. That is that hate speech restrictions can be used to further marginalize minorities and to serve to silence and further inhibit already discriminated groups. There is evidence that authoritarian regimes, who are signatories to the UN and other conventions, misuse hate speech and other laws to oppress, silence, and control dissenting and other groups. This argument has appeared in a slather of the anti-hate speech legislation materials published in New Zealand in recent months. Put simply, in regimes where the rule of law is systematically flouted, minorities and opponents of the regime are oppressed using legislation, including hate speech laws, but there's nothing specific about the hate speech legislation. I'll come back to that argument below. To answer the question posed by Beate tonight very directly, are hate speech restrictions a threat to our democracy? No, the proposed changes are not a threat to New Zealand's democracy. To now introduce the proposed changes. The changes are introduced in a Ministry of Justice document, Proposals Against Incitement of Hatred and Discrimination. The 34-page document is a shocker. It was introduced in with a very short feedback period, 25 June to August 6. Why do I call it a shocker? It reads as if it was cut and pasted by many different hands. It's both too detailed in places and informationally sparse in others. The introduction by the Minister of Justice, Chris Farfoy, begins with the Ministry's review and the recommendations of the Royal Commission into Christchurch. Although the details and context of their review are largely absent, and the Commission's one recommendation in relation to hate speech, which was adding religion, is rejected in favour of broader changes. The document is repetitive, giving the 6 changes 4 separate repetitions. At times it's unclear, everything is granted equal weight, and general policy reflections are side by side with detailed law changes of law. Its lack of overall organisation and clarity will both, I suspect, inhibit responses, but also create new spaces for willful and inadvertent misunderstandings and deliberate misrenderings. This seems like a lost opportunity to effect purposeful and purposive change. These are the changes recommended. Firstly, the number of protected groups is to be expanded from the 4 in the 1993 Human Rights Act, colour, race, ethnic or national origins, to include some, but it doesn't say which, on a longer list in section 21 of the Act, which include religious belief. I hate that term, religious belief, rather than religion. It's a very Protestant categorization and often unhelpful. Of course, religion was recommended, as I said, by the Royal Commission. It will include, we're told, the rainbow communities and people with disabilities. This makes perfect sense, reflecting the rise in identity politics and identification since the early 1990s. It also references other legislation such as the Sentencing Act, which can give judges the right to mandate heavier sentences for those motivated by hate. The 2019 UN Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech defines it as any communication that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or group on the basis of who they are. In other words, based on their religion, ethnicity, nationality, race, colour, descent, gender, and then the UN adds, or any other identity factor. And we've sought to limit that a little bit, but without much thought, I suspect. Secondly, it is the replacement of the criminal offence out of the replacing the Human Rights Act offence with a new criminal offence to be located in the Crimes Act, so that, quote, a person who intentionally incites, stirs up, maintains or normalizes hatred against any specific group of people based on the extended characteristics would break the law. If they did so, it continues, by threatening, abusive, or insulting, or including inciting violence. Now, they go on to say that this will include a threat, verbally or in writing or online, and so in this sense, it's to broaden out and accommodate new media for expression. Thirdly, the new offence would have appropriate penalties from 3 months to 3 years in prison, and from up to 7K to 50K fine. So it sees it as a much more serious offence. Fourthly, there's an attempt to tidy up so the civil law coincides with the new criminal offence they're proposing under 3. Fifthly, to enhance the existing civil provision to include incitement to discriminate as unlawful. The law would change so that a person was prohibited from inciting or stirring up other people to discriminate against any groups because of a characteristic protected by that law. A person who encourages others to treat members of a protected group worse or differently than others would be breaking the law. This person could then complain to the Human Rights Commission. Those are from the document. I'll come back to that. Now, I fully support this change, but I would want to see incitement to discriminate included within the criminal law, within the Crimes Act, rather than open up an avenue or new set of sub-legal remedies under the auspices of the Human Rights Commission. This change is hard to support, as given the lack of knowledge about the details of any such sub-legal provisions, making a decision recommending it or supporting it is to support the uncertainty and what we don't know. As the whole proposal seeks to maintain the amazingly high criminal threshold, this provision is vital and the document unacceptably deficient in elaborating this particular point. We're asked to support what we don't know yet, while ensuring that criminal prosecutions are as rare as they have been and allow all sorts of hate speech to pass under the bar. The final proposed change is to add to the grounds of discrimination in the Human Rights Act to specify that transgender, diverse, and intersex people are protected against discrimination. Currently, it's against the law to discriminate against people because of their sex. This is to broaden this out in terms of what's often called these gender identity or gender expression. Now, the law could be clearer about this, and this seems perfectly sensible. Now, none of these, as I've outlined, are particularly complex, and they're certainly not as complex as their presentation in the Ministry of Justice's document. Now, to bring this somewhere, I just want to return to the underlying arguments. I tried to, above, and much too elaborately, I'm sure, clearly distinguish what I'm calling the US position from that of other polities in relation to hate speech. As we saw, the US version hierarchizes rights and values so that other freedoms arise out of the freedom of speech. In relation to this priority, hate speech is seen as a subordinate right that needs to be balanced, that is, minimized to ensure maximal freedom of speech. The whole discourse of balancing rights as if it were an accounting problem is, I think, something we should reject. So the harm caused by hate speech is deemed less costly to society than the harm associated with restrictions on our right to free expression. But of course, if the priority of one right over another already exists, the balancing act will be affected by this scaffolding. So, for example, the International Advocacy Group Article 19 recognized that their reading of the priority of freedom of expression over hate speech entails acknowledging as Agnes Kalamard, their executive director, writes, that freedom of speech actually protects hate speech, unless it is proven to have led to incitement and imminent violence. And that she, as do so many, understand hate speech as a legitimate restriction on the freedom of speech. My position is simply we're asking the wrong question. It's not how do we balance freedom of speech with restrictions to freedom of speech in terms of defined categories of hate speech, but rather what sort of freedom of speech is it that not only includes that, but defends restricting and reducing human dignity and equality of our fellow citizens and other people, usually those already marginalized and discriminated against. Once free of the imposition of the dominant US paradigm, we can ask this much more significant question. Our freedom is not dependent upon demeaning, degrading, and dehumanizing others. This kind of US argument will have little relevance to New Zealand, as our proposed law changes, as evidence, anyway, what I go on to say is rather elaborately. I'm looking at my watch. If you look at the Free Speech Union or Family First, they recycle these American arguments, and they don't take it any further. There's very little engagement with the two sides in the speech. They're like ships passing in the night. Back to the US for 1 minute. I'm going to mention two books and then a concluding sentence. The brilliant Stanley Fish, in his recent book, How to Think About Hate Speech, Campus Speech and Religious Speech, Fake News, Post-Truth and Donald Trump, a very long title, in 2019, answers very convincingly in the chapter 1, Why Censorship is a Precondition of Freedom of Speech, that the conditions of constraint, that is not being able to say anything you like freely, is the norm, and some kind of free speech zone is an artificial constructed exception. In chapter 5 of the same book, Fish contends that the most dangerous of free speech axioms is the more speech, the better. As he puts it, the more speech leads only to more confusion and provides the opportunity for trolls and predators to do their nefarious work. I'll only mention the title of Caitlin Ring Carlson's book, Hate Speech, which has a rather lovely argument, which is that hate speech preserves the established order. My concluding two thoughts. Hate speech is an act of discrimination like any other, except it uses words. Hate speech is what lawyers call constitutive harm. The speech itself is harmful. It reinforces stereotypes and normalizes discrimination. We've periodically brought hate speech to the fore, with Rushdie in the 80s, Holocaust denial in the 90s, Danish cartoons in the first of the 21st century decades, more recently with Charlie Hebdo. The tide is rising again with identitarian and alt-right online, white supremacist and national hate speech online and in the public square. And for us in New Zealand, following the particular impetus of the Christchurch massacre. As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres puts it, hate is moving and moving fast into the mainstream. We have an opportunity to address this and counter these growing threats to our democracy. Now, one of the things that worries me is simply we don't have the kind of religious literacy to deal with this. We don't have judges who are trained in this way, and ancient Pakeha judges are unlikely to have experienced hate speech, and so leaving it to the lawyers is dangerous. If someone was going to say, what about Israel Folau? All I can say is, what about Israel Folau? I do agree that freedom of speech is essential to democracy, but I consider human dignity and equality to be equally vital to the maintenance of New Zealand's democracy. I support the legitimacy of criminalizing hate speech, but as you can see, I want to go much further and criminalize incitement to discrimination as well. The last thing I want to say is that hate speech is that hate speech legislation isn't a restriction on free speech, except as a kind of empty fantasy, but is the only way of preserving our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And I just want to thank you for introducing us into the topic and mentioning all the proposals. and because that is a good start so that people know what it is about, and and your opinion also on the restriction of speech, hate speech. And now I'd like to hand over to Professor Douglas Pratt and ask him, what do you think about hate speech restrictions? Is that a threat to our democracy?
No. I hope you can see me. No, I don't think so at all. In fact, it's pretty clear to me that there's a lot of confusion around the proposal to include religion within the new legislation aimed at curtailing and criminalizing hate speech where it applies to religion. Most opposition seems to be around concerns that such a move compromises free speech. For example, many non-religious secular opponents wish to be free to criticize religion, and many religious people want to be free to criticize other religions. So will the targeting of hate speech curtail such free speech? Not necessarily, in my view. We need to ask two questions. What is free speech and what is hate speech? Free speech is the right and freedom to express points of view, criticisms, judgments, and opinions in the context of rational discourse without fear of sanction or penalty from any state authority. It is the basic value of a pluralist society and an open democracy. Free speech, however, does not equate to saying whatever comes into my head. That is not grounded in some form of rational reflection, argument, or reason. Nor does it excuse the bellicose, belligerent, uncouth, or otherwise offensive utterance. Free speech is not a license to let the tongue run wild. Rather, free speech is premised on the notion that mature human beings are rational thinkers, not given to childlike outbursts that are little more than an expression of raw emotion. I hate you, mummy. You didn't let me have my friend to stay, or whatever. These things do happen, of course, and they are rightly judged as obnoxious behavior, not to be either encouraged or excused, but they're not otherwise sanctioned. So what's hate speech in relation to free speech? Hate speech is certainly different from free speech. It may well reflect some form of rational argument of a critical sort, and so appear to fit the criteria for free speech. However, its purpose and intention are not simply to critique and debate points of difference or issues of truth and falsity, discourse that certainly fits within free speech. Rather, the intention of hate speech is to denigrate, to demean, to deny the validity and value of the object of the speech, and in so doing, to inculcate, support, and advocate further abusive discourse and even violent actions in the enacting of a hostile rejection of the target. Hate speech feeds extremism. Extremism feeds violence, both verbal and physical. With reference to religion, I would suggest hate speech can be defined as the deliberate and intentional expression of that which is palpably false, or a contentious interpretation, or an unacknowledged misunderstanding, as if it was truthful or a factual statement, with the purpose of demeaning, dishonoring, and so effectively dehumanizing the targeted group or individual. In other words, hate speech targeting a religion as such, or any specific religion, is speech the content of which would lead any reasonable observer, along with the target, to register what is said as an expression of rejection, hate, or loathing. Such speech either implicitly or explicitly endorses and advocates deprecatory values and actions toward the target as being legitimate, even to the point of endorsing and justifying extreme attitudes and actions that underlie terroristic behaviors. Hate speech in this sense is the fertilizing element in the growth of anti-religious sentiment and often allied racism. It is the seedbed of extremism, as I mentioned, which in turn is the soil from which terrorizing violence springs. So it seems to me quite clear we need to actually curtail and indeed criminalize hate speech such as this. We can make the distinction certainly between emotive hate speech, that kind of outburst that, you know, I hate so and so or hate such and such, just registering an emotion is not the kind of hate speech I'm referring to. Rather, it's the distinction between an ideological, discursive sounding or looking type of speech that demeans, as I mentioned, which is different from the critique of religious belief or positions or so on from a rational debating point of view. Hence, I agree with Paul Morris that the notion of replacing the term religion with religious belief actually goes down the wrong track, because to critique a religious belief is not itself to evince hate. Hate speech is in response to a person's identity or group identity and demeaning and undermining that. And I think at that point, we really need to actually take distinctive action, because we can see what has happened within New Zealand with certain groups, whether it be Maori, whether it be Muslims, whatever, who have been the subject of this kind of denigrating, put down hate speech. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. And sorry, Douglas, now we have two Pauls, so that because now we are going to Paul from Auckland, and Professor Paul Spoonley will also tell us about his opinion on hate speech, and is free speech really under threat? So thank you very much, Douglas, for explaining more about what is hate speech and what is free speech. And now we'll hand over to Paul and about what you think about it.
Thank you, and kia ora tata katoa. Why are we talking about hate speech at this particular point in our history? I mean, the obvious question is that the Christchurch terror attacks and the Royal Commission have made it front of mind for all of us. And if we thought we were somehow exempt from these sorts of politics, we've learned a very, very painful lesson. But there are other reasons. One is that we've become an increasingly diverse society, and it's raised the question of the rights and responsibilities of ethnic and religious minorities. We've heard stories from those communities about their particular experiences and what they've been targeted in terms of hate speech. So it's raised our consciousness. The second thing is that we've understood that the increasing influence of the social media world, of the online world, has changed our lives. And of course, in this particular context, it's changed the possibilities for groups that want to express their hate to then provide those views in a one-to-many audience. Now, what we do know is that internationally, and unfortunately we don't have particularly good evidence for New Zealand, but internationally, the rise of online hate speech has increased significantly since about 2015 and 16. So if we go to the Anti-Defamation League or the Southern Poverty Law Centre or any number of groups, then what we see is this growth in online hate. So it's taken on a very different dimension. And of course, it's meant that countries like New Zealand are part of this international ecosystem. And so we are no longer exempt. And the next reason is that there is now good evidence to show that what's expressed online translates into real world outcomes, and in particular to acts of violence towards minority, ethnic and religious minorities. And so we've now got an understanding that what happens online, despite some of the arguments that are made, what happens online actually becomes a product in the real world, and of course translates into actions which demean and undermine the safety of particular groups. Now, what I'm concerned about at this point is that we do have some rather good documents and opinions being expressed around what the hate speech is, and you've heard some of those tonight from Douglas and Paul, but we're also striking some very significant political headwinds which misrepresent the debate, and it's not helped by a lack of understanding by key ministers. I am not as concerned as Paul Morris is about the material that's been provided by the Ministry of Justice. But what is clear is that we do need to have a debate and to bring people into that debate and to have an informed debate about the possibilities. What I would like to see is more debate about the severity threshold. So what we want to do is reaffirm free speech, but we want to then identify what sort of speech becomes hate speech. Stephen Price, who's a lawyer providing commentary on the New Zealand developments, has said that the proposal set a very high bar for criminalising speech, and I agree with them. And so what we have are two components. One is the intent of the speaker, and the other is the harm that would be done. And the second, the key test for me, is the degree of impact of the speech. So I'm not particularly happy with the proposed wording from the Royal Commission, which is to add and stir up. That has come from a British context, and that I don't think is particularly helpful. What I would do is point out that the Classifications Office have asked through a public survey about these issues. And what's interesting is that that survey shows that there is a very high degree of support, 79% in the particular question that I'm looking at, which is, should we be able to say whatever we want on social media if that leads to violence? And 79% of those being surveyed said no, people shouldn't be allowed to say that. I do agree that we need to revise our legislation. Our legislation comes from a very long time ago, from the early 1990s, and it really doesn't acknowledge the current circumstances and the rise of hate speech, and therefore I'm fully supportive of a discussion. The protected groups, by and large, I think we do need to increase those, because the Human Rights Act is simply not, the wording of the Human Rights is simply not appropriate to 2021 or the future. I am concerned about some of them. There's got to be a debate about protected groups in terms of political opinion and employment status. I was involved in the 1977 prosecution of two members of the National Socialist Party in Auckland, and that occurred under Section 25 of the Race Relations Act, and really does echo many of the current or existing legislation. The defence in that particular case was that Jews were a religious group and therefore were exempt from the legislation, which, by the way, the court did not accept that defence, but it does highlight what's one of the issues that does need to be addressed by an updated legislation. So I'm going to close now. I think we need to sharpen our focus and update our legislation to make it more appropriate. What we need also to do is have a public debate and an informed public debate about the possibilities. My own preference is to look to Canada and some of the legislation, and I was going to talk about that, but I'll leave that. Some of the legislation that is in place there, but also the way in which the courts have interpreted that legislation. We need to cover off online hate. That has become a significant issue for countries like ourselves. And at the moment, apart from what the Classifications Office does and the Harmful Digital Communications Act do, we do need to address online hate. And finally, I think it's a timely debate in that we need to identify and protect the safety and freedom of ethnic and religious communities in New Zealand. They should not be subject to the sort of hate that they have experienced in recent years. And that is something that we should talk about and decide as a liberal democracy that it's something that we ought to protect. That does not limit our freedom of expression. It enhances the freedom and identity of a range of communities in our country, Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, from Auckland. Thank you very much, all participants, and thank you for the panelists for the interesting comments and the interesting summaries from the different angles. And we've had a few questions coming up in the last few minutes. And I just like to start asking some of the questions. So First of all, there's the question about banning people from saying something discriminatory isn't going to stop them wanting to discriminate. It's like, I also had it from somebody else saying, just because people don't speak up doesn't make them angels. Douglas, would you like to say something on that?
No, it's an interesting question. I mean, the sense of curtailing speech doesn't mean that you change attitudes, and that's, there's a truism there. That's fair enough. But I think the issue actually is that it's really a case of how much in any context of what we might hold as a private opinion or a viewpoint, how much of that do we just simply blurt out and make public? A lot of us have thoughts, opinions, and ideas which are far better kept to ourselves, and mull on them and think on them and choose carefully what we say when we say it. That's really what this is, in some ways, is about. I mean, there's a lot of hate speech, which, as I indicated, might be sort of emotive, but there's often a confluence between an emotional reaction and a kind of putting down, dehumanizing dimension. And so people feel that I have the right to express myself, which is part of our zeitgeist. We have the right to say what we want to express, who we are, etc., etc. But the problem is, of course, that some people are doing that, and in so doing, it actually impinges on others and prevents them expressing themselves, if you like. So it's a case of balancing things up. No, certainly constraining hate speech won't mean necessarily people's attitudes within them change, but it may mean it dampens down the possibility of flaming or inflaming that kind of discourse, and therefore creating a sense of discomfort, disquiet, and even threat to a particular group of people.
Yeah, thank you, Douglas. And I just like to continue with the questions because we have quite a few questions. One is about the incitement to discrimination. So thank you, Douglas, for clarifying regarding the intent also, because you mentioned the intent. If somebody just says, I hate this and this, doesn't mean that this is hate speech. But there was a question specifically to Paul from Wellington. Could you please give an example of what incitement to discrimination is?
I could. Can I just a very quick comment on the last question? I mean, I don't think the purpose of hate speech legislation is to punish hate speakers. I mean, it's to set and very, very clearly indicate the norms within a society of what is acceptable and what are the limits to the toleration, the public toleration of hate speech. And so they set the hate speech sets a model of what's acceptable, rather than it being a way of getting the hate speakers. And so the broader aim is to change the culture and change the social norms. And now to answer the question you did ask, which, if I understood it, was why the emphasis on incitement to discrimination. And there are two reasons. My first is simply the growing body of evidence that it's a point that the UN have made, it's a point that Paul Spoonley just made, which is there's growing evidence that there is a causal link between discrimination and the dissemination of discrimination. And so people use discriminatory languages and models and behavior in order to incite others to do the same and to propagate incitement. And so the way in which videos of atrocities are used, the ways in which material is promoted and passed on and recycled, etc., etc. So the first reason is simply that the incitement to discrimination, I mean, is part of a way of addressing the issue of escalation, of that translation from words into action. The second issue is that it is already unlawful to discriminate. And so what we're talking about here is encouraging people to break the law, to the incitement to discrimination. Our existing human rights legislation makes it unlawful to discriminate in terms of sex and in terms of employment, etc., etc., etc. To encourage people to break the law is itself in other domains of the law unlawful. So it's a matter of consistency and a matter of de-escalation.
Thank you, Paul. And then there's another question about quite a practical one. Is hate speech causing violence the only harm that we should criminalize? What of hate speech resulting in or contributing to job loss or loss of other services like accommodation? Verbal attacks on racial minorities and transgender people have been linked to real-world harms that don't always go as far as attacks. Where should we draw the line? So who would like to answer that? Is Paul Spoonley? Would you like to say something about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and that the question of boundaries and the severity test is one that we really do need to establish very, very clearly. Ultimately, it will be a decision for the police in terms of prosecution and of the courts in terms of deciding what it is. But prior to that, we need the legislation which both represents a political consensus, if you like, but it also is clear in terms of providing guidelines. And at the moment, I don't think the legislation is clear and it's not appropriate. And therefore, the question is whether or not there are other forms of outcome, there are other outcomes which arise from beliefs and hate. And of course, they should be encompassed in terms of some forms of legislation. But as Paul has already just pointed out, some of that is encompassed amongst other forms of legislation. And I would point out that hate speech itself, or variants of it, are actually addressed in a range of existing acts as well. There's also another question, which is whether there are other processes which should precede prosecution. And I think there should. And of course, even though this moves to the Crimes Act, the proposal is that it moves to the Crimes Act, there is still a civil component which stays with the Human Rights Commission. And I always say educate before legislation, or educate before legislate, so that what we don't want to do is simply say that hate speech legislation is the beginning and the end of what we should be doing. It shouldn't be. There are a whole lot of other things that should sit alongside that, including forms of negotiation and addressing the issues in some sort of non-legal environment.
Thank you very much, Paul. Then I have another question here that is more about the details about hate speech. So when is ridiculing religious symbols through cartoons or other graphical material hate speech? I think that also goes into your area, Paul, from Auckland, because you were talking about the other countries of hate speech in the context of graphical material also. Then connecting to this is defining another person's sacred symbol or space an offense, or can it be shown as it was an intent to spread hate? So I think that's an important part where we have to look at where does it start, especially with religious symbols. Where does the hate definition start?
Can I defer to my colleagues on that one because they're more?
Yep, that's fine. Who would like to answer?
Well, yes, it seems to me that particular question ties in with comments I made about, the bellicose, belligerent, uncouth, or otherwise offensive utterance is not necessarily in and of itself a hate speech. It's obnoxious. It's impolite, it's so on. So but having said that, if for example there's ridicule or defacing a symbol, for example, defacing a religious symbol, or like the gravestones being defaced, etc., that goes beyond any sense of something which is just unpleasant, because behind that is a message of rejection and non-acceptance, and that becomes then is kind of like the seedbed of hate, because you reject something, you want to remove it from society, you know, that those kind of tendencies that have been throughout history in different places, and in recent times very dramatically so, you know, behind that is either an implicit or an explicit level of hatred being expressed. I think you know, there's that comment that Paul Morris made about it's not so much a case of trying to punish the hate speaker, may not be able to change his or her mind, but it's dampening down the acceptability, which is very widespread in our society at the moment, of hate speech being articulated, and without recognizing its impact on people, including that particular question about you know, the threshold in terms of is it just to do with violence, physical violence? No, I mean, if hate speech is a speech which deliberately sets about to undermine, to demean, to devalue, to dehumanize a group and persons within a group, and it can lead to violence, but before that, it can lead to all sorts of other kind of limitations being put on people, which in a free and open democracy is quite, you know, is not what we want. It's inimical to our society. Therefore, we must take steps to ensure that everybody can equally participate, and to equally participate means you are not subject to those kind of attitudes, values, and expressions that are hateful, in the sense that it's actually demeaning you and dehumanizing you and making you out to be less than what you are. So I think, yeah, that would be my response to that off the cuff.
Thank you very much. One question is there a good reason to keep grounds under paragraph 61 and 131 HRA, color, race, ethnic, national origin, and religion separate from matters of discrimination under paragraph 21? I think it's Human Rights Act. The former focused on racial religious harmony, and the latter focused on social cohesion. Paul from Wellington, is that a question for you?
Yeah, it can be. The issue of extending the categories is, I mean, seems a perfectly sensible thing. I was suggesting it's because the way in which people identify with groups and with plural groups, I mean, is higher in priority than perhaps it was when in the 1990s. So in that sense, extending the groups has some logic and has some real resonance. The racial disharmony thing is the new suggestion is much more explicit. So I don't think. I mean, I think that's also a particularly good thing. But I think the lines, and I'm going back to the last question, which is very naughty again, but I'll come back to this. I think the lines are very difficult. We already exclude satire and humor in terms of our press, our regulation of the press, the Broadcasting Standards Act, etc., etc. And so I think it's a very line. One of the issues that Paul Spoonley raised was with increasing ethnic and religious diversity, you have quite different value systems, I mean, in operation. And things like the Charlie Hebdo case in France, I mean, highlight the necessity to understand often offence in ways which is novel and new. the 3 centuries of satirical history in the West, perhaps much longer, but certainly in graphic and cartoon form, which has been a totally legitimate way of engaging in political, well, I suppose, in political humor by ridiculing those in power and etc. is perfectly sensible. But of course, the level of offence and the levels of response, were unanticipated and incredibly disturbing. And it's not that they need to be catered to, but they need to be acknowledged. Back to, I think that the proposed changes in relation to the criminal bar are just as high in relation to violence, but are probably better formed than the earlier legislation, but we still need to have a very serious engagement with the level itself and the what I'm calling the sub-legal alternatives.
Thank you, Paul. And then there's another question about the victim narrative. So there's a concern that these laws might fuel any victim narrative that racists already have. Would like to answer to this one?
Can I begin by just noting
Yes.
that when you look at the Human Rights Commission and the complaints received by it, over the years, it's very often been that Pākehā have complained about the way in which they've been represented or misrepresented by a particular group. So the idea that somehow that there are small groups of highly sensitive members of a particular minority ethnic and religious community who are most likely to use this legislation is actually not borne out by what's been happening. And so the majority group, the Pākehā group, feel is likely to use this type of prerogative, legal prerogative, as much as any other group. And I think that's part of what we need to explore and understand and anticipate in terms of what might happen here. When you look back at, we've had provisions like this for a very long time. When you look back, they've only been used on 2 occasions, which is the prosecution of the National Socialist People's Party and the Louisa Wall versus Fairfax case. And somehow the idea that, that a particular group are going to suddenly use these provisions, particularly as I would anticipate the provisions are going to set a very high bar indeed of what constitutes hate speech, and that a lot of speech and a lot of activity and victimhood are suddenly going to become much more into play, I think misunderstands both what's happened in the past and what's likely to happen in the future. So it's an interesting question, but I just don't think there's evidence for it in terms of what's happened.
Thank you very much, Paul. We are already coming to an end. The time flies so quickly, but I just want to make a comment because there has been somebody asking, why are they all men? They are not representative of the population. And I have to say, we also, not only have we 3 men, we have also 2 Pauls. And we have to, and I think that we can say this is just, it happened to be like this, but we just didn't, they were the men who were available and the men who were happy to speak on this topic. And it's not, we did not choose them because they were men. It just happened to be this way. So we can't discriminate somebody just because he's a man that he can't participate. So I just want to end with this comment, but I think that it's certainly this discussion has started or continued a debate, and that's what these discussion papers are about. They are discussion papers to be discussed, and the submissions close on the 6th of August. So if you have any comment and you'd like to communicate with the government, we'll put up the address that you can use in order to make your comment and to express your opinion on this topic. Thank you very much to the three panelists, Professor Paul Morris from Wellington, Professor Douglas Pratt from Waiheke, and from Professor Paul Spoonley from Auckland. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night. Okay.